Back in 2019, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, begging and believing, the mythical Shenmue 3 finally clawed its way into existence. Fans across the globe had convinced themselves they were about to experience the second coming of gaming itself, a continuation worthy of the Dreamcast's most ambitious saga. And what did they get for their patience? A half-baked relic that looked like it had been left gathering dust since the early 2000s. It featured gameplay mechanics that many felt hadn't evolved a day beyond the year 2001, and story beats that felt like the developers had forgotten the very reason people adored the franchise in the first place. Put simply, Shenmue 3 was one of the most crushing disappointments in video game history. But yesterday, like a phoenix staggering out of a skip fire, Yu Suzuki and friends returned to the headlines with the announcement of Shenmue 3 Enhanced. Yes, apparently the game so many swore off forever is coming back, remastered, refined and promising to finally deliver the experience people dreamed of when they first slapped their hard-earned Kickstarter cash down nearly a decade ago. Could we be about to see the redemption arc Shenmue so desperately needs, or will this be just another cruel tease to keep the cult of Hazuki Ryo hanging on by a thread? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Let's talk about Shenmue 3.5, the game that promises to change everything. When Shenmue first released in 1999 on the Sega Dreamcast, it wasn't just another big title. It was the most expensive video game ever made. Reports of the time put its budget somewhere between $47 million and $70 million, a staggering figure when you consider that most big games of the late 90s were being developed for a fraction of that cost. Sega essentially bet the house on Yu Suzuki's vision, believing this ambitious blend of open-world exploration, real-time weather systems, voice acting, cinematic storytelling and quick-time events would be the console-saving blockbuster the Dreamcast desperately needed. While the game never recouped its astronomical budget, what it achieved was groundbreaking. Players weren't just handed levels, they were given an entire community to exist within, one that felt alive with routine, detail and authenticity. Essentially, it brought gaming immersion to a level never seen previously. Then came the sequel, Shenmue 2, doubling down on that ambition. Released in 2001, it expanded the world enormously, trading the sleepy Japanese port town of Yokosuka for the sprawling vibrancy of Hong Kong and Guilin in China. Here, the player was free to wander vast city streets, interact with hundreds of NPCs, and explore areas that felt bustling and organic long before open-world sandboxes became the norm. Though the production costs again soared into the tens of millions and Sega were already in dire financial straits, the sheer scope of the game was unlike anything else available at the time. For those who played it, Shenmue 2 wasn't just a sequel, it was proof that gaming could aspire to cinematic storytelling and world building on a scale that felt decades ahead of its time. It's precisely because of that ambition, that uncompromising attention to detail that Shenmue became so special to so many people. For those who experienced it, it was a glimpse into the future of the medium, a taste of what interactive entertainment could be if technology, imagination and budget aligned. Now here's the part you're not going to believe. Despite being two of the most ambitious, expensive games ever made, right now through my affiliate links you can grab the HD versions of both Shenmue and Shenmue 2 for an eye-watering 93% off. That's just $2.80 for two of the most legendary titles in gaming history. And if you want the full experience, don't worry, you can get Shenmue 3 for the exact same discount, meaning the entire trilogy will set you back a grand total of about $5. But listen carefully, those deals don't last, they vanish fast, and once they're gone. So use my links below today, stock up your library while the bargains are still live, and enjoy thousands of other discounts while you're at it. Happy shopping and hope you enjoy the rest of this video. When Yu Suzuki first conceived Shenmue, he didn't imagine it as a simple one-off title or a video game that would just get one sequel. His vision was a grand 11-chapter saga that would chart Ryo Hazuki's journey across Japan and China in pursuit of his father's killer. It was a story designed to unfold gradually, with each game serving as one piece of a much larger narrative tapestry. But almost immediately, reality clashed with ambition. As mentioned, the original Shenmue was the most expensive game ever developed at the time, and while it was critically praised, the Dreamcast's limited install base meant the game never had a chance to sell enough copies to justify its budget. Shenmue 2 pushed the boundaries even further, but again it cost a fortune to produce, and by the time it hit shelves in 2001, Sega was already in financial freefall. Within months, the Dreamcast had been discontinued and Sega had withdrawn from the hardware market altogether. To fans, it seemed obvious what that meant. Ryo Hazuki's quest would never be completed, the saga was stranded on a cliffhanger, and Suzuki's great unfinished epic was destined to become gaming's most infamous loose end. For nearly 2 decades, Shenmue existed in a strange limbo, remembered with reverence by those who lived through the magic, but spoken of in the same breath as other impossible dreams like Half-Life 3 or Star Wars Episode 7 directed by George Lucas. Even when rumours cropped up, fans had conditioned themselves to roll their eyes. The idea of a continuation felt absurd, too expensive, too niche, too much of a relic from a bygone era to ever find back in. After the Dreamcast's demise, there was an era whereby the very mention of Shenmue 3 carried a mythical quality. It wasn't just a game people wanted, it was the great what if of gaming, a legendary unfinished story whispered about on forums, demanded in petitions, and brought up at every opportunity whenever Yu Suzuki so much as appeared in public. Fans would bombard Sega events with Shenmue 3 when chance, or beg Suzuki in interviews for any scrap of hope. When the Xbox was first unveiled, rumours swirled that Microsoft would pick up the torch. When Sega began publishing games for the PlayStation and Nintendo, whispers spread that a sequel was secretly in development. Time and again, hopes were raised only to be dashed. This endless cycle of speculation, silence and disappointment created something few other series can claim. A cult that not only loved the original games, but lived in constant hunger for closure. It wasn't just about wanting another title to play, it was about wanting to see the story finished, to finally understand why Ryo Hazuki's journey would end. For many, Shenmue became less a game and more of an unfulfilled promise, frozen in time since 2001. So when that E3 2015 stage announcement happened, the moment Yu Suzuki walked out and the word Shenmue 3 appeared on the screen, the internet practically exploded. It was surreal, almost unbelievable, like a collective hallucination. For fans who had spent half their lives waiting, it felt like the impossible was finally happening. Donations poured into Kickstarter at record speed, message boards were flooded with disbelief and celebration. Gaming press outlets ran headlines describing it as one of the most historic moments in E3 history. But with the hype came a double-edged sword. Expectations that no game, no matter how lovingly crafted, could realistically live up to it. Shenmue wasn't just remembered as a good Dreamcast series, it was remembered as a groundbreaking, once-in-a-generation event. The years of waiting had magnified the legend, and when fans finally had their hands on Shenmue 3 in 2019, that legend collided headfirst with reality. What was once gaming's most beloved unfinished story instantly became one of its most infamous disappointments. So what exactly went so wrong? Let's start with the obvious, the graphics. Fans weren't expecting The Last of Us Part 2 levels of fidelity, but what they got looked like something straight out of a mid-budget PlayStation 2 title. Character models were stiff, plastic and oddly dated, as if they'd been fished out of an abandoned 2003 tech demo. Ryo Hazuki's famously stoic expression went from being a charming quirk to an unintentional punchline as he stared blankly through hours of dialogue with the emotional range of a mannequin. Even NPCs, long considered one of Shenmue's strongest points for their routines and world building, felt hollow and cartoonish, a far cry from the lived-in authenticity of the original Dreamcast entries. Then came the gameplay. Shenmue had always been a slower, more deliberate experience, but Shenmue 3 doubled down on that in all the wrong ways. Basic movement felt clunky, interactions were unnecessarily drawn out, and worst of all, the game introduced bizarre stamina and hunger mechanics. That meant Ryo had to constantly eat to maintain his energy, turning exploration into a chore as players were forced to shovel food into him just to keep him moving at a reasonable pace. But these issues were just the tip of the iceberg. Combat, once a point of pride in the series, fared no better than other parts of the game. The original Shenmue had been praised for blending virtual fighter style mechanics into its brawls, giving fights a sense of weight and complexity. Shenmue 3 replaced that with a sluggish, simplified system that stripped out the depth fans once loved. Enemy AI was laughable, battles felt repetitive, and victory rarely carried any sense of satisfaction. For a series that once prided itself on bringing arcade quality fighting into an open world adventure, it felt like a betrayal of the very DNA that made Shenmue special. And then of course there's the story. After waiting 18 long years to continue Ryo's quest for revenge against Lan Di, fans were desperate for meaningful progress. Instead, Shenmue 3 offered little more than wheel spinning. Entire hours were spent chasing chickens, chopping wood and engaging in menial side activities while the central plot barely moved an inch. Ryo's confrontation with Lan Di, the payoff fans have been dreaming of since 1999, amounted to little more than a half-hearted tease, leaving the saga dangling yet again. To pour nearly 2 decades of anticipation into a game, only to discover it functioned more like filler than a climax, left many fans rightly furious. Even the much-touted Kickstarter campaign became a sore point. Backers who had pledged their money in good faith felt burned by decisions like Epic Game Store's exclusivity, locked content, and a general sense that promises made during funding hadn't been kept. Instead of feeling like honoured supporters of a beloved dream project, many felt like they'd been duped into propping up a product that didn't deliver. All of this combined into one undeniable truth. Shenmue 3 felt less like a grand continuation of a legendary story and more like a time capsule, a game stuck in the past, released into a world that had moved on. What had once been revolutionary in 1999 now felt archaic in 2019. The slow pacing, the wooden characters, the clunky systems, all of it clashed with the modern expectations. For newcomers, it was bafflingly outdated. For veterans, it was a painful reminder that sometimes the magic of a bygone era simply can't be recaptured. So let's quickly break down why we got what we got. Well, a big part of the issues with this game lie with Yu Suzuki himself. For all his brilliance, the man is, after all, the creative mind behind Outrun, Virtua Fighter and the original Shenmue. He's not what you would call a gamer. Suzuki has openly admitted in interviews that he doesn't really play games. He comes from the old school arcade designer's mindset, an engineer's perspective on interactivity, rather than that of a modern player who keeps up with how the medium has evolved. That might have been fine in the 1980s and 1990s when Suzuki was blazing trails ahead of everyone else, but in 2019 it meant he was effectively trying to continue Shenmue in a vacuum, without the awareness of how far expectations for storytelling, pacing and polish had moved on. Then there's the budget. The original Shenmue and Shenmue 2 had Sega's full backing, with tens of millions of dollars funneled into their production. Astronomical sums for their time. Shenmue 3 meanwhile was cobbled together from Kickstarter money and outside investment, and while the final budget has never been fully disclosed, it was a fraction of what Suzuki once had to work with. This meant that despite all of the hype, the game was never realistically going to rival the scale or polish of modern AAA titles. It was being made on AA resources at best, yet carried AAA expectations. That gap between what people dreamed of and what was actually possible with the money on hand created an inevitable sense of disappointment. On top of that, Suzuki's design philosophy hadn't really changed since 2001. He wanted to make Shenmue 3 feel like a direct continuation of where Shenmue 2 left off, almost as if no time had passed at all. The problem is, time had passed. Nearly 2 decades of innovation, refinement and audience expectations had reshaped the industry, and Shenmue 3 arrived frozen in amber. Instead of feeling like a bold revival, Shenmue 3 felt like it had slept through the evolution of the medium and woken up 2 generations too late. The end result was a game caught between 2 worlds, a nostalgic continuation for diehards, but a baffling throwback for newcomers. Suzuki's lack of engagement with contemporary gaming combined with a modest budget and a stubborn refusal to modernise created the perfect storm. Shenmue 3 wasn't just flawed, it was almost destined to be a disappointment. And that brings us to the recent news. Against all odds, Yu Suzuki and his team have returned to the headlines with the announcement of Shenmue 3 Enhanced. Yes, that's right, the very same game many had written off as one of the biggest disappointments in modern gaming history is getting a second life. This new edition promises lots of changes and improvements designed to address some of the criticisms that plagued the original release. In other words, it's a chance to finally give Shenmue 3 the kind of polish it so desperately needed back in 2019. It's an interesting move, because for years fans assumed Shenmue 3 would be quietly buried and forgotten, a curiosity from Kickstarter's golden age that had its moment and then faded away. Instead, we now have Suzuki doubling down, attempting to reclaim some of the goodwill that was lost. And while it's easy to roll your eyes and dismiss this as too little, too late, there's also something fascinating about it. Creator Yu Suzuki, in partnership with Enin Games, has announced that an enhanced edition of Shenmue 3 is on the way for PC, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series XS, and Nintendo platforms. Unveiled at Gamescom 2025, Shenmue 3 Enhanced is being positioned not just as a technical update, but as a direct response to the criticisms levelled at the original release. The most obvious overhaul comes in the visuals, with a full 4K uplift, sharper textures, richer environmental detail, and smoother performance across the board, an answer to complaints that the game looked dated even at launch. Load times are being slashed, animations cleaned up, and NPC density increased, all in an effort to make Shenmue's world feel alive in the way fans once remembered. Then there are the quality of life changes, many of which directly tackle long-standing frustrations. Chief among them is the controversial stamina system, one of the most universally loathed aspects of Shenmue 3. Players found themselves shoveling apples, garlic and random convenience store snacks into his mouth every few minutes, not because it added any immersion, but because the game would otherwise grind to a halt. What might have sounded like a clever simulation mechanic on paper ended up turning the entire experience into babysitting, micromanaging calories instead of progressing the story. Worse still, food cost money, and money was already a precarious resource in Shenmue 3, meaning players were forced to waste their earnings on bread rolls just to stop Rio collapsing in the street. This did not feel like fun, it felt like a harsh punishment. It slowed down every aspect of the game, broke the pacing, and actively discouraged exploration, because wandering too far from your next objective meant hemorrhaging stamina and wasting resources. For many players, this was the breaking point. They weren't turning Shenmue 3 off because they didn't care about the story, they were turning it off because the game made simply moving around its world feel like a chore. That's why the enhanced edition is making stamina optional. It's an admission that the system wasn't immersive, it wasn't realistic, and it certainly wasn't fun. It was an anchor tied around the game's neck, one of the biggest reasons Shenmue 3 went from a long-awaited dream to a patience-testing slog. It was completely painful. Health will also now automatically restore before combat encounters, and that alone fixes one of Shenmue 3's most baffling design choices. In the original release, if Ryo entered a fight while low on health, there was no safety net. Players who had been exploring, talking to NPCs or simply wandering around town could suddenly find themselves forced into combat already on death's door. And if you hadn't stocked up on healing items, which as mentioned are expensive and not always convenient to get, you could be wiped out before the fight even had a chance to begin. Most players were constantly afraid that any diversion could leave them crippled for the next mandatory battle, which means automatic health restoration doesn't just make sense, it corrects a fundamental flaw that undermined the entire pacing of the original game. Then there was the money barriers, another mechanic that turned progression into a grinding nightmare. Shenmue 3 frequently forced players to earn large sums of money before they could move forward in the story, locking key narrative beats behind the endless menial jobs. Whether it was chopping wood, fishing or gambling, players found themselves grinding repetitive tasks for hours just to afford the next step. It wasn't optional side content, and it felt like padding designed to artificially extend the game's length. For a series that once prided itself on immersion and storytelling, this approach felt like busy work, stripping away any momentum the plot might have had. Fans had waited 18 years to see a Ryo's journey continue, and instead of a gripping revenge tale, they got an exhausting grind that constantly interrupted the narrative. Reducing these money barriers in the Enhanced Edition is more than a tweak, it's an admission that the original design suffocated its own story with needless drudgery. By streamlining progression, Suzuki and Enin will hopefully finally be allowing players to focus on the adventure itself, instead of forcing them to spend half their time swinging an axe at logs just to pay the bills. It's also worth adding that in the original release, even something as simple as navigating menus felt unnecessarily clunky, with slow transitions, awkward layouts, and a general lack of polish that made basic tasks like checking items or managing resources more irritating than they needed to be. The Enhanced Edition's streamlined UI is planned to strip away that needless friction, letting players focus on the game rather than fighting the interface. Meanwhile, the inclusion of a classic camera option is a direct nod to long-time fans who felt Shenmue 3 lacked the cinematic framing of the Dreamcast originals, where camera angles carried a deliberate sense of style and atmosphere. By addressing both the usability and nostalgia in one move, these changes acknowledge some of the quieter but still significant reasons players felt disconnected from the original release. But there are still more cool changes planned to break down. Perhaps the most telling changes in Shenmue 3 Enhanced are the narrative adjustments. Conversations dragged on with awkward pauses between lines, wooden delivery, and the same stilted animations repeating endlessly. Cutscenes, meanwhile, overstayed their welcome, forcing players to sit through exchanges that added very little to the plot. If you'd already seen a scene on a replay, or if you simply weren't interested in a minor NPC rambling on about garlic prices, too bad! You were locked in, and for many players that was enough to sap any sense of momentum from the story. The Enhanced Edition intends to address this by finally allowing both conversations and cutscenes to be skipped. That single addition will dramatically change how approachable the game becomes, especially for modern audiences used to tighter pacing. Players who want to power through the main story should now do so without being trapped in endless dialogue loops, while those who enjoy soaking up every detail can still play at the original rhythm. It's a small sounding tweak, but one that might fix one of Shenmue 3's most notorious frustrations. QuickTime events, or QTEs on the other hand, have always been central to Shenmue's identity, but in Shenmue 3 they often felt uninspired, repetitive, and limited in scope. What was once a groundbreaking mechanic back in the Dreamcast era came across as dated, and even the moments designed to thrill lacked impact because of how basic the prompts were. By expanding and diversifying QTE sequences, the Enhanced Edition is trying to breathe new life into one of the franchise's signature elements, ensuring they feel less like tired relics and more like meaningful cinematic interactions once again. Crucially, Suzuki hasn't turned his back on the purist crowd. Nearly all of these updates, from skipping cutscenes to adjusting stamina and combat tweaks, will reportedly be able to be toggled off, allowing players to experience Shenmue 3 exactly as it was originally designed, warts and all. In short, Shenmue 3 Enhanced is attempting to walk a fine line, addressing the clunkiness and frustration that push new players away, while still preserving the slower, more deliberate design philosophy for the die-hard fans who argued that was part of Shenmue's charm. It's an ambitious balancing act, one that raises the question of whether the game can finally reconcile its fractured legacy. We can only hope. Do not forget that through my affiliate links below you can grab the HD versions of Shenmue and Shenmue 2 for a staggering 93% off. That's both of Sega's most ambitious classics for less than the price of a cup of coffee. And if you want the full saga, Shenmue 3 is sitting at the exact same discount, meaning the entire trilogy can be yours for about $5. But don't sit on it, these deals never stick around for long, and once they're gone. So check the links, fill up your library while the offers are live, and while you're there you'll find thousands of other bargains waiting as well. Thanks for watching, happy shopping, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheerio!